Okay, let's unpack this. We've got quite a collection of sources here, actually. Reports from Rasmussen, articles from Fox News, Newsweek, SETI S, The Washington Examiner, even some discussion off Reddit, and a Department of Justice opinion from, 2005?
That's right. And it all seems to circle around this one pretty significant controversy from the end of former President Biden's term.
The Autopen, the alleged use of it, and these really serious questions it kicked up about presidential authority and capacity.
Exactly.
So our goal with this deep dive is basically to sift through these sources, right? Look at the claims, the counterclaims, the legal points they're making about this whole Biden Autopen situation.
We need to look at how the sources link the Autopen allegations to the talk about cognitive decline, which specific documents they're flagging, the whole legal background of using these signature machines, and, of course, the political blowback reported.
Yeah, it's really this fascinating mix, isn't it? Technology, presidential health, political power, all colliding.
And the sources really leave you wondering, who was actually making the final call on some of these things?
That's the million-dollar question they raise. All right, let's get straight into it. What did the sources actually say? Starting with the main charge.
Okay, so the core allegation, laid out pretty clearly in sources like the Biden Autopen controversy investigation, Greg Jarrett's piece on Fox News, is this. Top Biden aides supposedly misused the Autopen.
Misused how?
Well, the claim is they used it specifically tied what the sources describe as his serious cognitive decline. And by doing that, they were essentially exercising presidential power themselves, which, raises a constitutional question.
Right, exercising power they don't actually have. And who are the sources saying is leveling these charges?
Primarily, the sources point to former President Trump and key Republicans in Congress, like House Oversight Chair James Comer. They're the ones really driving this narrative, according to what we've read.
Okay, and this link to cognitive decline seems absolutely central here.
Oh, definitely. The sources constantly connect the alleged Autopen use to their reports of Biden suffering from, quote, serious cognitive decline. They often suggest it was even worse behind closed doors than what the public saw.
And that aides were actively trying to cover it up. There's even a mention I saw referencing the special counsel's report.
Yeah, the Her report finding about his memory, some sources bring that up, describing him as, that well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory and unfit for trial, using that finding as sort of supporting evidence for their claims about his state.
So the Autopen becomes the alleged tool for this concealment.
That's the argument presented, which leads directly to this question of who was really running the show. Was it Biden, or was it, as some sources put it,
this cabal or coterie? I saw those words used.
Exactly. Unelected staffers may be operating a kind of de facto presidency, making the big calls. The Autopen, in this view, is what let them put the official stamp on things Biden maybe didn't fully grasp or approve himself.
So it's not just using the machine. It's about the alleged lack of genuine presidential consent and capacity behind it. That's the core concern being voiced.
Precisely. It's about who's wielding the actual power.
Okay, let's move on to the specifics. What documents are supposedly involved?
Sources mention a pretty wide range. Pardons, executive actions, signing bills, proclamations, even appointing federal judges. But pardons really seem to be a major focus.
A particular flashpoint, and they name names, don't they?
They do. There are allegations about Autopen-signed preemptive pardons for people like Dr. Fauci, Liz Cheney, and several members of the January 6th committee.
Preemptive, meaning before any charges were even filed. Interesting.
And then there's the list of Biden family members whose pardons are reportedly questioned because of alleged Autopen use. James Biden, Sarah Jones Biden, Valerie Biden Owens, and her husband, Francis Biden.
Quite a list. But there was a contrast drawn with Hunter Biden's pardon, wasn't there?
Yes. One source, the Greg Jarrett article, again, makes a point of this. It says, Hunter's pardon, while broad, apparently looks like his father's real signature.
Unlike the others on that list.
Unlike the others mentioned, yeah. The article suggests this raises legitimate questions of intent about those other pardons. Did they get the same level of personal review? Did they even go through the normal DOJ process? That's the implication.
So the signature itself is being scrutinized as potential evidence.
Right. And beyond pardons, commutations are mentioned too. Specifically, the 37 federal death row inmates whose sentences were commuted just before Christmas 2024. That's cited as another example under scrutiny.
And what about executive actions more generally?
Big focus there, too. Some sources claim the Autopen was used for, quote, the vast majority of Biden's executive actions.
A vast majority? That's a huge claim.
It is. And they particularly point to the second half of his term when, according to them, these questions about his capacity were really growing.
Is there a specific example they highlight?
Yeah, the LNG export pause, that executive order. Speaker Mike Johnson is quoted in one source recounting a conversation where he claimed Biden didn't seem to remember signing it.
And critics seized on that.
They held it up as potential evidence, yeah. That maybe the signature, possibly an Autopen one, went on without his full conscious approval.
Which loops back to that fundamental constitutional concern they keep raising.
Exactly. That if the Autopen wasn't just for convenience, but was allegedly used to cover for incapacity, and major actions were taken without his genuine direction, well, that's potentially an unconstitutional power grab by aides, possibly making those actions invalid.
Okay, this definitely brings us to the legal side of things. How solid is the ground for these kinds of claims?
Well, it's complicated. The core legal question, as the sources frame it, is, are these actions legally valid if the president didn't truly consent or wasn't mentally competent to consent when the Autopen was used?
And that 2005 DOJ opinion is pretty central here, right? What did it actually say?
Several sources dig into this. Basically, the Office of Legal Counsel concluded back then that yes, the president can legally sign a bill, for instance, by having a staffer use an Autopen under his direction.
Even if he's not physically there.
Right, even if he's not there. They based it on the common law idea of what signing means. You can authorize someone else to sign for you. Their action becomes your action, legally speaking.
Okay, so the use of the machine itself isn't necessarily the problem, legally speaking, based on that opinion.
Not inherently, no.
Oh.
But, and this is the absolute critical point emphasized in the sources drawing of that opinion and legal arguments.
There's always a but.
Always. The president cannot delegate the decision-making power. He can tell someone, sign this document for me, but only after he has personally decided to approve that specific document.
So the aide is just performing the physical act, the ministerial task. They can't make the judgment call.
Precisely. They can't decide whether to sign, only how to sign once directed. That's the line the DOJ opinion drew, and it's the line critics allege was crossed.
And if that line was crossed, if he didn't consent or wasn't competent,
that's where the arguments get serious. Sources like Jarrett argue those documents could potentially be declared null and void.
On what grounds?
They bring up common law fraud, basically, if a signature is obtained deceitfully or without real consent. One source even points to an old Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Throckmorton from 1878, which said fraud can invalidate even solemn legal acts. The idea is maybe that principle could apply here.
Wow, going back to 1878, so potentially voiding pardons, executive orders?
That's the argument being made, to vitiate them, make them legally ineffective.
But hang on, the Reddit discussion sources seemed a bit more skeptical about actually challenging this in court.
Yeah, that's a good point. Those discussions highlight how tricky judicial review would be. There isn't really a clear roadmap for a court to step in and rule on a presidential action based just on claims about mental state or how the signature was made.
Like, how would a judge even determine if the president really decided? What proof would you need?
Exactly. What's the standard of evidence? Is it just more likely than not? Or clear and convincing evidence, which is a much higher bar? And how would the whole process even work? It's pretty much uncharted territory legally.
So the legal principle about needing presidential direction seems clear, but actually proving it was absent in court and overturning something much harder.
It sounds that way based on the sources discussing the legal hurdles. And we also have to remember, as some sources and the DOJ opinion itself note, presidents have used Autopens for a long time.
Right. It's not like Biden invented it.
Not at all. Decades of use for routine things like signing lots of letters or commissions, but also for signing legislation sometimes.
Didn't Obama use one while overseas?
Yes, that's mentioned, to sign an extension of the Patriot Act while he was in France back in 2011. So the tool itself has a history of legitimate use for important actions if the president directs it.
So the argument isn't about the Autopen existing. It's about the alleged circumstances under Biden, the link to capacity questions, and whether he was genuinely giving the orders for these specific actions.
That's the core of the controversy as presented. It's the context, the alleged intent, not just the machine.
Okay, which brings us to the politics of it all. How did the Biden camp, according to the sources, push back against these pretty serious claims?
Well, Newsweek and Fox News reported Biden's direct response. He basically called the investigation a distraction.
A political move by Trump and Republicans.
That's how he framed it, yeah. Said their real aim was to advance their own agenda, like making tax cuts permanent, which he argued would hurt other programs. And crucially, He flatly denied the premise.
How so?
He insisted he made the decisions on the pardons, the executive orders, the laws, the proclamations. He called the idea that anyone else was making those calls ridiculous and false.
So a firm denial, standing by the legitimacy of the actions taken during his term.
That was his public stance, yes. And, other counter-arguments pop up in the sources, too.
Like what?
Well, the Reddit discussions, for example, had people questioning if alleged incompetence alone is even grounds to invalidate actions, and pointing out, as we said, that other presidents, including Trump himself, use Autopens.
Right. And CBS News mentioned a legal expert saying Trump probably couldn't just wave a wand and revoke Biden's pardons anyway, given how pardon power works.
Yeah, that presidential pardon power is historically very broad and difficult to challenge once granted. Plus, some on Reddit tried to turn it around, questioning Trump's own mental fitness, sort of pot calling the kettle black argument.
As a contrast, though, one source, that Fact Sheet Trump piece, it made a point about Trump's signing ceremony.
Ah, right. They highlighted his practice of often signing things publicly in front of the press.
Framing it as transparency.
Exactly. Presenting it as proof he was physically signing and aware of the documents, contrasting that with what they portray as the secretive, possibly unsupervised use of the Autopen under Biden. A way to show presidential accountability, as they put it.
Which just highlights how political this whole thing became. Legal arguments wrapped up in a political fight.
Absolutely. It's about legitimacy, transparency, fitness for office, all being debated through the lens of this machine.
So let's try and wrap this deep dive up. We've looked at these sources detailing serious allegations, unauthorized Autopen use tied by critics to presidential capacity concerns, suggesting maybe others were pulling the strings.
And we've contrasted that with the strong defense.
Yeah.
The president insists he was in charge, he did direct these actions, and there's historical and legal precedent for using an Autopen with that direction.
It really paints a complex picture, doesn't it? Specific stories like the LNG order or the different pardon signatures, mixed with these big legal ideas and historical context, all viewed through a very sharp political lens.
It shows how even something seemingly small, like how a signature gets on paper, can blow up into huge questions about power, especially when a president's health is part of the conversation.
Yeah. It definitely leaves us with a broader thought, I think, beyond just this specific case. In our modern age, with technology allowing leaders to act remotely, to delegate tasks, how do we as citizens, how do our institutions really guarantee accountability?
Especially when those difficult questions about capacity are raised. How do you ensure transparency?
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. What does this whole Autopen debate suggest about the challenge of confirming who is truly, consciously making the decisions in the highest office? Especially as technology continues to evolve. It's really a question about trust, technology, and the fundamental core of presidential responsibility.